Dobrý večer, veľmi pekne ďakujeme, že ste prišli dneska v takom veľkom počte. Čakal som, že keďže začína Veľká noc, tak to tu bude dnes také prázdnejšie, takže ešte raz veľká vďaka. My sme už od roku 2017 sa rozhodli organizovať takéto diskusné podujatia. Minulý rok sme tomu dali aj názov a pod týmto názvom Kapitalks a pod týmto formátom odtedy fungujeme. Niektoré tieto Kapitalks ste mohli vidieť asi aj inde ako v Bratislave, niektoré v Bratislave a mnohé z nich asi v najbližšej dobe uvidíte aj v priestoroch A4. A my sme veľmi radi, že pri príležitosti nového čísla, ktoré vyšlo pred pár dňami, a je to číslo o Audre Lorde, toto je ono, sa nám podarilo zavolať veľmi vzácnu hostku a je to brazílska umelkyňa Luiza Prado, ktorá nám dnes porozpráva niečo o svojom diele a o tom, ako rôzne koloniálne, postkoloniálne teórie a feministické teórie sú súčasťou jej diela a aký má dopad brazílska politika na jej dielo a naopak. Takže budete počuť takú krátku prednášku s vizuálnym doplnkom a potom po prednáške bude kurátorka Zuzana Jakalová s ňou viesť diskusiu, ktorá samozrejme bude otvorená, takže môžete sa čokoľvek opýtať, určite vám Luiza rada odpovie. Toľko k tomuto trošku zbytočnému úvodu a slovo odovzdám teda Luize. Luiza, vítaj.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Is it on? Is it? Okay, this is on, but is the projector?
Yes.
Not. Yeah. Okay, good. So, hello everyone. Thank you for coming before Easter, and because it's so beautiful outside and we're here in the dark. And thank you, Tomasz and Susanna, for the opportunity to be here today. So I have no clue what Tomasz just said, but I'm gonna introduce myself anyway. I'm an artist and researcher, originally from Brazil, and I've been living in Germany for the past 10 years. And in my work, I investigate tensions between technologies of birth control and bodies through feminist and decolonial lenses. So for the past year, I've been developing an artistic research project that I'm calling A Topography of Excesses, where in this project I examine technologies of birth control in relation to colonial processes that produce categories of race, gender, and sexuality. And this project starts from kind of a meditation on the excesses that Eurocentric conceptions of body, knowledge, community, and subjectivity attribute to the colonized. And under such definitions, the problems that affect our communities in the Global South and also communities of color in the North are attributed not to the violent and systematic exploitation established by the colonial project and continued by capitalism, but to faults found within ourselves. We're framed as, at the same time, incomplete, lacking the humanity represented by whiteness, and excessive at the same time, too numerous, too sexual, too fertile, too emotional, too much. So starting from these reflections, I propose through this project kind of a reframing of history, and by which I mean to subvert and reject colonial narratives
looking into the idea of excess, the space of excess really, as one of intersection and a space where revolutionary politics can emerge through exchange and solidarity, really, amongst marginalized peoples and communities. So why am I looking into these things? So for the past maybe 5-6 years, I don't know, I've been researching technologies of birth control also as part of a PhD that I did. And I was very interested in looking into gender and looking into colonial processes in general, especially being from Brazil. That was something that I kind of wanted to unpack, the relationship between those things. And throughout this process, I started finding so many parallel histories in relation to several different technologies of birth control, actually. I think one good example, like a very tangible example, is the birth control pill, which is something, I mean, I guess everyone knows. And I think the story of the birth control pill illustrates quite clearly how historically people of color have been, and continue to be actually, exploited for all kinds of labor directly related or somehow adjacent to reproduction and fertility. So consider, for instance, the history, of the contraceptive pill, as I was saying. From the extraction and processing of the barbasco yam, which is a yam that grew wild in Mexico. And this was the raw plant matter that was first used to synthesize progesterone. And in this process, in the process of extraction and processing of this yam, Mexican workers were kept by an American company in a state of indentured servitude, essentially. And even their scientific contributions, they developed their own ways of processing this yam in a way that would extract as much active compounds as possible. But even those contributions were not considered scientific contributions. They were not considered knowledge because they were coming because of the place and the people that they were coming from. It was, you see that during, this very early process of the development of the pill. And you also see these same colonial relations in, for instance, the clinical trials, actually, that, are required for any medication to be approved. You need to have clinical trials before. And the clinical trials for the pill were carried out in Puerto Rico, actually, which is to this day an American colony. And these tests were carried out in poor neighborhoods, slums, prisons, mental health hospitals. So all these, in a way, almost like disciplinary enclosures, really, in people that were not informed fully or could not comprehend fully what was being done to them by these scientists. And that was done even with the participation of US American feminists. Margaret Sanger, one of the biggest symbols of feminism in the mid-20th century, like early to mid-20th century in the US, she was deeply involved with these trials. Her and Catherine McCormick also, who was a suffragette also, and she funded the trials, actually. She was very wealthy, and she provided a lot of the money necessary for those trials. And she actually said and that's documented in several books and studies, that she mentioned even to the scientists who were leading the studies that they needed, and this is a quote, a cage of ovulating females to experiment on to develop this. So, yeah. So yeah, I mean, every aspect of the pill's research and development is deeply, deeply enmeshed with the economic and political domination exerted by the United States in Latin America. And I'm not even going to get into how the pill was very quickly approved for use and for commercialization in several countries, like Brazil, for instance, during the 60s, in 1960, which is exactly when it came out in the US too. It took still a few years for it to be approved for use, like commercialization in Europe, but it was immediately approved in Brazil, also as part of Operation Condor, which is something that if you haven't heard about, you should definitely look that up. It was essentially a CIA facilitated operation for the articulation of dictatorships all over the continent in the 1960s as a response to the Cuban Revolution and in the context of the Cold War. So, yeah, you know, and of course it's no coincidence that Latin America and of course other places in the global south were seen as this playground for experimentation and for the development of things that ultimately were not meant for the well-being of people there, but they were meant really for the sexual liberation of white people in the north, essentially. I think it's very useful to think about what decolonial scholar Maria Lugones says about how the cohesion, the creation of what she calls a colonial modern gender system was fundamental to the establishment and continuation of the colonial project. She says that even though all the aspects of this gender system that was established through the colonial project are violent, they manifest this inherent violence in different ways. Whereas, for instance, white women were encumbered with perpetuating the white race, non-white people, and particularly women of color, were understood really as animals that could withstand all kinds of even physical labor and reproductive labor too. And of course, it is no surprise then that, you know, within this inherently violent hierarchy, the bodies of women of color are really required to perform all kinds of work for the benefit of white heteropatriarchal systems. So this is kind of a background into why I'm so interested in this subject. And so the body of work that I've been developing over the past years spans video essays, performances, sculpture, installations. And I started looking into actually histories of herbal birth control in Brazil as a big part of this project. Not only because, you know, I gave you like a very bloody and like depressing really background for why I'm interested in this, but of course every type of oppression is always met with resistance, you know, and there are many, many different ways that people have resisted this kind of domination. And the use of herbal remedies has historically been very present in Latin America. I'm sure in many other places too, but of course I'm speaking, you know, for the context that I'm familiar with. And yeah, and also like even personally familiar with, because, you know, there's histories like in family about, you know, the use of these remedies. And very specifically, I was interested in the fact that abortion to this day is illegal in Brazil. And it's not only illegal, it's very stigmatized. It's intensely stigmatized. It's seen as immoral and really pretty much like the worst thing a person could ever do. And this is, of course, a function of colonization too. It is a result of colonization and the catechization of people. Even contraception, even though it is legal, of course, has been placed in jeopardy in the past years by increasingly strict laws which aim to limit access to medications, essential medications, like the morning after pill, or devices like the IUD. And this, again, no oppression is met without resistance. This leads people to develop all sorts of strategies and ways to manage fertility. And knowledge about birth control, herbal birth control passed down mostly orally amongst people is a key part of that. And all of these plants, cinnamon, papaya, wild carrot, rue, peacock flower, all of these plants become part of an alternative history and an alternative history of knowledge, really. One in which really other futures and other possibilities are conceived through a practice that I've been calling radical care. Now, when I started this project, of course, things were shifting a lot in Brazil. On March 14, 2018, during the very week when I was actually writing the outline for this project and thinking, like, really conceiving this project, activist and politician Marielle Franco was executed in Rio, my hometown. Her killing sent really huge shockwaves around the country and internationally too. And a country that was already undergoing turmoil for a few years. The message it sent was that if Marielle, who was a famous and respected leftist politician, could be executed like that, what could happen to all other activists? It was a very clear message to all of us who are politically active in Brazil, in a country that was clearly becoming very, very hostile towards anyone fighting to shift colonial and capitalist structures that govern Brazil since European occupation, really. But I'm not sure, even with, this is something I ask myself sometimes, I'm not sure even with her execution that we were even able to fully capture the magnitude of the problem that we were facing. Bolsonaro, which you probably have heard about, is unfortunately our president right now. He still did not appear to be a viable candidate. And though he had been garnering followers, he was still mostly a marginal nut job that didn't really have a chance at being elected. So maybe I'll play this, because that will probably give you an idea of who this man is. So yeah, unfortunately we were wrong of thinking that he didn't have a chance, although that became increasingly clear throughout last year. And this has not been a very easy decade for Brazil, especially the past 6 years. The country has undergone a profound shift towards the right, and not without the help and intervention of the United States, by the way, who implanted several think tanks, not only in Brazil, but all over Latin America, devoted to spreading and sustaining and funding right-wing movements all over the continent. So in 2000, to give you maybe, it's maybe useful to give you an overview. In 2013, which is kind of, a lot of people see that as the genesis of the mess that we're in right now. The country was engulfed by massive, massive unrest, massive turmoil, huge protests all around the country. Originally, those protests were quite progressive, and essentially the demands were for things like accessible transportation fares, this kind of thing. But these protests were hijacked at some point. They went on for quite a long time, a few months, and they were hijacked by the right. In 2016, we had a coup where President Dilma Rousseff from the Workers' Party was removed. And with that, there was like an increasing targeting of leftists, feminists, LGBTQ activists, and so on. In 2018, we had the murder of Marielle, the election of Bolsonaro, and throughout this whole process, also an increasing censorship and persecution of artists and academics and professors and even like student organizations within universities. In 2019 now, it's I don't know, one of the things that we keep repeating is that it feels like things are happening at a completely impossible pace. Everything is happening so fast. So in 2019, we've had professors arbitrarily arrested, a huge increase in hate crimes, including crimes specifically committed in Bolsonaro's name by fascist groups. And it also came to light that the Bolsonaro family has very, very close ties with the mafias that run certain parts of Rio, and specifically with Marielle's killers. One of her killers was his neighbor, by the way. So we're in a situation where a significant part of the population, and it's probably, I'm looking at you so I'm not seeing it, but there's probably some of the things that Bolsonaro has said over the years playing here. This is one of the works that are currently installed at Display Gallery in Prague, where Susanna is a curator. And so in this work I kind of wanted to, I'm kind of superimposing this footage of me kind of putting inside my mouth an entire month's worth of birth control pills with, on the right side, that's the right, on the right side, this footage of Bolsonaro in Congress and all of the things that he said over the years, together with like all of these other things that are appearing here, are works that have somehow shaped European perception of what Brazil and what Brazilians are. So there are paintings by Albert Eckhout, who went to Brazil in the 17th century to, and he produced a series of paintings that aim to show through, and that's, you know, the key word, almost, it's considered almost like an objective representation of Brazil. And it shaped a lot how Europeans perceived Brazilian indigenous peoples and the growing population, mixed population of Brazil. Another work, oh, I really used display to talk about Display Gallery. I'm sorry, that is a terrible choice of words. Another work, but I'm going to use it again. Another work that is displayed at Display is, I did that. It's this video essay. So in it, I start from an examination of the presence of this plant that I've been studying for a few years called the peacock flower, which is also known as ayowiri, in the proximity of the Marechal Zenobio da Costa military police battalion in the district of Tijuca, Rio de Janeiro, which is where I grew up. Ayowiri is a plant that grows quite abundantly in the tropical areas of the Americas, and I learned also in South Asia quite a lot. And during the European occupation of the continent, an infusion of this plant, a tea of this plant, especially the root and the bark, was often used as a contraceptive and in stronger doses and as an abortifacient by enslaved and indigenous African peoples as a way to resist the condition of enslavement, as a way to refuse to perpetuate that condition and to serve white supremacy. So I started researching this plant, and I first came across it through like historical documents, but at some point it clicked on me that this plant was a plant that I actually knew. It wasn't something from like an old book. It was something that I knew growing up in my neighborhood, and that this plant grew all along this so it's this avenue here that is depicted here on Google Maps. In this avenue, there's a river that cuts through this avenue, and this plant grows quite a lot. It's used actually as urban decoration in many places in Brazil, because it's a plant that is very beautiful. It doesn't require a lot of care, and the roots grow straight into the ground, so it doesn't destroy the pavement around it. And when I realized, I was very marked by how this plant, you know, this plant that is secretly so subversive, to use a word that was used to describe any leftist activist by the dictatorship. So this plant that is so subversive, it grows around this police battalion. And I'm particularly interested in the encounter between that space of the battalion and this plant, because during the Brazilian military dictatorship, which ruled the country between 64 and 85, the complex was the local headquarters of DOI-CODE, which was the intelligence and repression agency of the regime. Within those walls, countless people were brutally tortured and murdered by the regime. And I actually was reading a book recently that this part I didn't know actually when I was doing this film, but this was the place where most people were murdered and killed by the regime in the entire country, where there are the most murders documented for the regime. So yeah, in this film I tried to engage with this brutal and yet very, very recent aspect of Brazilian history, which is celebrated by Bolsonaro also, and to link it to the broader history of colonialism and sexual violence, because of course a regime like that, torture also means a lot, very often sexual torture, particularly targeted at women activists. Now that we've talked about terribly depressing things, there's also, you know, I think it's very important to recognize the pain of this history and to understand why. I think it's important to drive home why we need to be so fierce in opposing these kinds of structures. But there's also so much beauty and so much joy in organizing and in resisting. And in this project that I'm showing here, this is actually originally a net art piece that I've adapted as like an analog piece for some exhibitions, including at display again. So in this project, I wanted to explore the idea of writing an essay through gifs. And I wanted to engage with these practices of birth control, which were really like my core focus on A Topography of Excesses. And look into the transmission of indigenous and folk knowledges as acts of radical and decolonizing care. And through the histories of Ayurveda and other contraceptive and abortifacient plants, this essay kind of explores the idea of radical decolonizing care and unravels the poetic dimensions of excess as kind of I see it almost like as a fragmented, fast-paced, multi-pluriverse, meshing together pasts, presents, and futures, really. And also, there's another performance here. This was a performance that I did originally at Savvy Contemporary in Berlin, where I cooked and served a dinner of traditional Brazilian dishes that I've grown up eating and cooking with my family, but prepared with ingredients that I kind of see as leading a double life. They are both known food sources, while they're also being used. Different parts of these plants are used in herbal preparations for birth control and for abortion. The dishes, this is something I always have to say, the dishes that we served are safe. They're not meant to provoke any adverse effects on people who are pregnant or people who are planning a pregnancy or anything like that. But rather they're meant to nurture conversations on really the medicalization of bodies, these notions of radical care, and really the poetic dimensions of herbal remedies. And this dinner was accompanied by a poetic reading, where some of these threads I unraveled through a story that I imagined of a garden of abortifacient plants located in a very, very charged place in Rio called the Quinta do Boa Vista Park. Originally, this park was Tamoyo land, and later, Tamoyo indigenous land, and later this park became actually the seat of the Portuguese Empire when the Portuguese royal family fleeing Napoleon went to Brazil and transferred their entire court to Brazil. So the National Museum of Rio that was destroyed in September 2018 by a fire is also located in that same park, which to me further embroils the threads that trace the complicated history of colonialism and the production of knowledge tied to that place. And in this story, these narratives unfold through the eyes of two women, Julia and Julieta, who first start sewing this garden at the beginning of the 20th century. And the story stretches until the night of the fire, kind of invoking really the possibilities for counter-hegemonic politics of care and solidarity for presents, pasts, and futures. And to kind of wrap up, so through these works, I'm very interested in establishing dialogue and to think in terms of open-ended scenarios, to understand that the notion of time itself is multifaceted, that the notion of what is present, past, and future, what is knowledge, is different in different contexts. This approach is very inspired by what the Zapatista, the Mexican Zapatista Liberation Front proposes. They've been active for quite a couple of decades, and the movement proposes radical strategies of resistance to the domination of colonized peoples, aspiring to what they called the creation of what they call un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, that is a world where many other worlds fit. And more than anything, I think the decolonizing work that I engage in, together with various allies and comrades in different groups that I'm part of, means knowing that the changes, and I think this is very, very important, the changes that we want to see in the world will likely not come within our lifetimes. But I think it's very, very important to be humble enough to understand that this is no reason not to continue in this struggle. And decolonizing work really is never over. And we're fighting with 500 years of history. This is a huge, huge shift that we're proposing. But this is no reason not to do it, because decolonizing work is also a matter of survival. And you know, it is a lot of work, it is hard, but decolonizing work is also full of joy, as I said. You know, the joy of sharing and building a vision of this world of many futures, this world where many worlds fit, the joy of finding allyship and solidarity, and the joy of community building, and sometimes even in the most unexpected places. So I think we'll end on this note, and thank you for listening.